Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham. We've had a very interesting debate, and can I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Gateshead, who told us about his 30 years as a councillor. He must have been elected about the age of 14, I think, to the council, but he certainly kicked off the debate extremely well. And I think it was very important that he drew attention to the House of the Rota report, which I think could be the subject of another debate in and of itself on the issue of free schools and their approach towards issues of equality. We also had a very good contribution from the Honourable Member for Southport in his usual philosophical fashion. He gave us a trot around the arguments in relation to free schools and also highlighted some important incidents which he's been made aware of. My honourable friend for Easington, I thought, made a powerful plea for fair treatment and fair comment on the schools in his own East Durham area, and quoted the Secretary of State of saying that they had the smell of defeat about them. Well, I know that the Secretary of State in many ways is an extraordinary man, but he must have an exceptional sense of smell, Mr. Gray, if, having never visited those schools, he can detect the smell of defeat about them, and I think that says everything. And finally, we had a contribution from the Honourable Gentleman for Bradford East, who I think should be congratulated for the manner in which he has attempted, in the face of great difficulties, to expose the scandals at the King's Science Academy in Bradford, and pointed out, as I saw him on his own local media at one point, pointed out that some of the people that the Secretary of State had approved to run that school and to spend millions of pounds of taxpayers' money were not only not fit to run a school, they were not fit to run a bath, in his own inimitable phrase. And I think in his contribution this morning, he's absolutely made clear why that is the case, and I'll say some more about that later on in my remarks. Can I welcome the Children's Minister? He's one of the nicest people in the government, as is his PPS. But we would like to know where the Schools Minister is, and it would have been better, I think, had the Schools Minister come along today to listen not only to myself and my colleagues, but also to his own colleagues from the Liberal Democrat Party in relation to the policy for which he's responsible in the Commons, at least. And I've noticed that recently in parliamentary answers, written answers as well, that the Children's Minister is being deployed as a kind of human shield for the Schools Minister in relation to answering questions on some of these subjects, including free schools policy. So I do hope that's not going to become a trend, but I guess it's understandable, given that he's being asked to defend what my own right honourable friend, the Shadow Education Secretary, has rightly described as a dangerous ideological experiment which has been allowed to run completely out of control. And I think in hearing what the honourable member for Bradford East said this afternoon, I think he's given us a fine example of the manner in which this is out of control. And of course, he's right. We've had schools, we've got lots of schools with, despite what the Honourable Gentleman for Southport said, unqualified teachers written into those schools as a kind of a policy, but also unqualified leaders, schools being built where there are already surplus places, schools with a dangerous lack of oversight and transparency, as we've already heard this morning. And of course, this is exactly what the government planned, actually. It's no accident that we are now hearing more examples of head teachers resigning. Another one resigned yesterday at the IES Breckland Free School to follow the resignation of the 27-year-old unqualified head at Lord Nash's, a government minister's own Pimlico primary free school. We're hearing more examples of disastrous teaching, such as at the Almadina free schools, and allegations of financial fraud at Almadina, and also, as we've heard, at the King's Science Academy in Bradford, as well as the ongoing investigation into the Barnfield Federation in Luton. And I do say to the Minister, we'd like a guarantee from him that there won't be a cover-up this time in relation to the investigation that the department is undertaking, and that is printed immediately upon its completion rather than being sat on until Newsnight get a leaked copy of it, as happened in the case of the King's Science Academy in Bradford. And the reason I say this is what the government planned is because they told us that they expected this policy to result in this kind of failure. We have the words of the Secretary of State's hand-picked advisor, who was brought into government against the ethical objections of Andy Coulson, Mr. Dominic Cummings, who the Secretary of State has described as one of his heroes, who said in his recent 250-page memo that this kind of fraud and failure was an integral part of the free schools policy design. He said, and I quote, this is what he said: "Some free schools will fail and have predictable disasters, from disastrous teaching to financial fraud." That's what the Secretary of State's own special advisor said about this policy. Predictable disasters. So there we have it. The lack of oversight is not an accident, as the Honourable Member for Bradford East pointed out. It's part of the design of this ideological experiment. And a bit of failure, according to the government, is fine if you have unqualified teachers. Some financial fraud, that's okay, because in the long run, presumably some good schools will emerge from the carnage of the experiment. And the fact that pupils have their education disrupted along the way, as in the case of the Almadina Free School, which had to be closed for a week, is just the collateral damage and a price worth paying, presumably. So we've got it from the Secretary of State's advisor that we should expect failure, and we've got it from him that we should expect fraud, and of course clearly he's right, and at least he's been honest about that, because all we've had from the rest of the department is delay and obfuscation when they've been questioned about all of this. And much of this relates to the way that ministers are hopelessly conflicted about this policy. How can a minister be both a promoter of free schools and an adjudicator of them? Because that's the situation we have now. How can the Secretary of State be both propagandist for his free schools experimental policy and overseer of that policy at the same time? Because he's responsible for all of these schools. He's like Dr. Frankenstein. He's in love with his own creation and can't see the dangers even when the evidence is staring him right in the face. Just last night, we had further revelations, Mr. Gray, about the Almadina Free School on Channel 4 News. And perhaps today we will finally get some action, because I understand that Lord Nash might be able to, for a day, forget that he's a free school promoter and remember that he's a government minister with responsibility for the proper use of taxpayers' money. Ofsted described this school as, and I quote, dysfunctional and inadequate in every category, with unqualified teachers, without proper training, and now new allegations of financial irregularities over the letting of contracts. And I want the Minister to tell us today, and I'm not sure whether he'll need some in-flight refueling in order to answer this question, but I want him to tell us today whether he can confirm that Department for Education ministers or officials received from Derbyshire Police correspondence relating to the funders of the Almadina Free School before it was opened. And will he commit to publishing that correspondence? So just to be clear, did they get letters from the police, any correspondence from the police before Almadina was opened? And will he publish that correspondence? And then we come to the King's Science Academy in Bradford, and I just want to spend a little bit of time on that. It was opened in 2011, as the Honourable Member for Bradford East pointed out, and the patron of the school, or the beneficiary of the school, as he said, is Alan Lewis, who is a vice chairman of the Conservative Party. The school was built on Mr. Lewis's company land, and he stands to make, as we've heard, £6 million in rent over the 20-year period of that agreement. On the 25th of October, nearly 6 months, certainly over 5 months since its completion, the department published a redacted report from its financial investigation, which it had carried out at the King's Science Academy only after there had been whistleblowing from within that institution. It's very interesting the way they redacted the report, actually, Mr. Gray. They redacted the name of Mr. Lewis, actually, from the report, despite the fact that it's in the public domain, these financial arrangements they had. They even redacted the name of the head teacher of the school in the version that they released. And we have to wonder why, and perhaps the Minister can explain why it was necessary to redact the name of the head teacher of the school, which is in the public domain, or the principal, as he calls himself, and also of the of Mr. Lewis. They rushed out the report hours before Newsnight. That might explain, I suppose, the clumsy redactions. They rushed it out hours before Newsnight, which had already been leaked a draft copy just a few hours before it was due to go on air with its story. And the report found a whole host of financial irregularities, including that someone at the school admitted that it submitted fabricated invoices to claim money from the DFE as part of its setup grant and identified £86,000 of this grant which had not been spent by the school for the purpose for which it was intended. And the report recommended that these matters should be passed on to the police for investigation. And as has been pointed out, on the 25th of October, the department said the DFE had reported the matter to the police, and I quote, who decided no further action was necessary. Now, that seems very odd to me, Mr. Gray. After all, invoices have been fabricated. Why hadn't that resulted in any proper criminal action? And initially, of course, the DFE's version of events is that they reported the matter to Action Fraud on the 25th of April with a follow-up in September when they were told that the police had decided to take no further action. However, once all this became public, only because of the Newsnight investigation, West Yorkshire Police contacted the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau to ask about the case and were told that there had been, in inverted commas, an administrative error, which meant that the matter was passed on to the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau as being for information rather than as a report of a potential crime. So 5 days after the DFE report is made public, West Yorkshire Police put out this statement. I'll quote it from it briefly, Mr. Gray. The Department for Education reported the matter to Action Fraud on the 25th of April 2013. It was recorded as an information-only case, not as a crime. This was not sent to West Yorkshire Police either as information or for investigation. The National Fraud Intelligence Bureau have now assessed the report in line with nationally agreed protocols and have today sent it for investigation by West Yorkshire Police. And that's where we are now, and we know that people are being interviewed. So the matter had not been properly passed on to the police for more than 5 months. And the department say in September they contacted Action Fraud to ask for an update, and they were told by the police there was nothing more to do with it. Now, why at this stage didn't they ask more questions? Why at this stage didn't they dig and find out that it was an administrative error? And I think we need to understand that. It now emerges, actually, that the Department for Education didn't even submit their report to Action Fraud. They simply made a telephone call to their helpline. And I have here the page for the Action Fraud web page for its helpline, and it says on their page, Mr. Gray, we provide a central point of contact for information about fraud and financially motivated internet crime. If you've been scammed, ripped off, or conned, there's something you can do about it. Report fraud to us and receive a police crime reference number. So presumably the Secretary of State and his officials believed they might have been scammed, ripped off, or conned by the management at the King's School Academy, who are all still in place, by the way, that they might have been scammed, ripped off, or conned, which is why they rang up the helpline. They didn't send the report in, they rang up the helpline to report this to them. And it goes on to say, report fraud to us and receive a police crime reference number. So my question to the Minister is, can he tell us today the police crime reference number that his department was given by Action Fraud when they dialed 0300 123 2040 in order to report the fact that they believed they'd been scammed, ripped off, or conned by the King's Science Academy in Bradford. Can he tell us what that police crime reference number is? I'll give way.
Also aware of the fact that West Yorkshire Police have no record at all of the call being received on the 25th of April.
Well, I'm very grateful that he's put that on the record, because one of my next questions was going to be, given that it says, when I rang up myself the Action Fraud helpline last night, just to check, it said that the calls are recorded when you ring them up. So presumably we should be able to, and the Minister should be able to obtain from us from the Home Office, the recording of the telephone call made by the Secretary of State or one of his other ministers or officials, presumably back in April, to Action Fraud to report this crime and when they were given their police crime reference number as a result of it. And we'd be very interested to hear that when we get it. So, Mr. Gray, the public deserves to know exactly what was said when the DFA reported this matter to Action Fraud, and which led them to regard it only as, in inverted commas, information. What was said when Action Fraud told the DFE police were taking no further action? And also, how were Action Fraud able to make that statement? In other words, how did Action Fraud get an update from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau without the administrative error coming to light at that point? And in the meantime, what's happened at the school? The principal is still in post. The DFE says they gave the school a financial notice to improve, but this has never been published. Will the Minister publish the financial notice to improve that was given to them by the department? The DFE has also said the school is carrying out an internal investigation, as has been pointed out already, and any disciplinary action is a matter for the school. How can the department defend this position? In what other walk of public life would this be acceptable? It's worth remembering that none of this was in the public domain before the report was leaked. Mr. Gray, it's a murky business, and it would be better for the government to publish the records of all its dealings in relation to this now. Otherwise, it will face the drip of revelations as the details inevitably leak out. All of these problems, this particular example, are a product of the design of the policy. Everyone in this room wants to see innovative schools with appropriate levels of autonomy, being able to do their best to provide the best education possible for the children in their constituencies. That's a value I think we all share. But it is irresponsible to design a policy with the fact that failure is inevitable in mind, as the Secretary of State and Special Advisors have done, and then not to have any proper oversight over the spending of public money and over the impact of that policy on the young people in the care of these schools. There are more scandals to come. As the Minister knows, his department's currently investigating other cases. Why doesn't the Minister now come clean, answer the questions, and also admit that it's time that we have proper oversight of these schools?